Megan sat in the plush armchair beside the window and watched the streets. A number of figures had passed within the last half hour. They had moved out of and faded back into the mist like phantoms, never lingering. Even though the street was empty, she didn't dare relax. Seeing her town so quiet was surreal. There were no more dogs left to bark, no car horns blared, none of her neighbours argued or started their lawnmowers, even though it was Sunday morning. At least, she thought it was Sunday morning. She was starting to lose track. Taj approached from behind. He had shed his shoes in favour of layered socks, and she wasn't aware of him until he leant over her shoulder and passed her a note. "Is it safe to open a tin?" Megan slipped a pen out of her pocket and carefully wrote back, "I think so. Haven't seen any for a few minutes." Taj nodded and returned to the kitchen, his padded feet making no more noise than Megan's heartbeat. That was important. In this new world, the world of the sightless, noise equaled death. No one was completely sure where they'd come from. The earliest news reports, the ones that had made it through before the media blackout, said they'd poured out of mines that had gone too deep. A few people called them aliens, although that was an unpopular phrase, as they'd come from inside the earth. Others called them demons, but they had very little in common with the demons Megan had been raised to believe in. Megan and her two companions, Taj and Lisa, called them sightless. They couldn't see, and they couldn't smell, though they somehow seemed quite comfortable navigating the suburban neighbourhood. The only way they could find their prey, humans, was through sound. Megan didn't know how many people were still alive in her street, possibly none. Before the media blackout, before the creatures had rushed through her town like a deadly wave, there had been stories of entire cities being overrun. She hadn't seen any of her neighbours for more than a day. She was lucky, she knew. Her parents had been preppers. That hadn't saved them from the sightless, but at least it had ensured Megan's pantry was filled with tins of long-life food and 5-litre jugs of water. It was enough to keep herself, Taj and Lisa alive for a few weeks at least. There damn well better be a rescue before those weeks are up. She had no idea how the rest of the world was faring. For all she knew, the military was deploying weapons against the sightless at that very moment. On the other hand, humanity might have been all but destroyed and reduced to little pockets of survivors like in Megan's house, not speaking, walking with silent care, terrified that at any moment a sneeze or a cough could force their hand. Megan glanced behind her to where Taj had taken a large can of beans out of the cupboard. Lisa stood, leaned against the bench, her long tan hair hiding half her face. While Taj was a long-time friend, Megan didn't know much about Lisa, only that she'd stumbled into their house on the night the sightless had invaded, and was grateful they'd allowed her to stay with them. Taj eased the can's ring up, and then began tugging the lid free of its seal, with slow, gentle motions. Opening cans was always a risk. Sometimes they were perfectly silent, but other times the metal whined. They tried to reduce their risk by waiting until there weren't any sightless in the streets, but mist had rolled through that morning and reduced Megan's visibility to less than a dozen feet. Taj had the lid halfway off when it let out a high-pitched squeal. He froze, and his eyes bugged. Megan rose to her feet and stared at the window, praying that there hadn't been any sightless close enough to hear. One of the creatures slunk through the mist. Its eyeless, noseless face turned towards her window. A second followed not far behind. Megan couldn't even breathe the swear word that hung on her tongue. The window's glass had been broken out on the night of the invasion. Megan's parents had tried to fight back. Their bodies were gone, but the blood would never come out of the walls. Megan took an involuntary step backwards, holding her breath and praying her heartbeat wouldn't be audible. The first sightless stepped easily over the window's sill. Its long, leathery grey legs were as silent as Megan wished her human limbs could be. It passed her so closely that she could smell the decaying flesh that tainted its breath. Its mouth, a long gash covering the otherwise empty, tapered face, opened a fraction, exposing the off-white teeth inside. It moved through the house with deceptive slowness. Megan had seen how quickly they could run when they pinpointed a noise. Faster than a cheetah. The second Sightless climbed over the sill. Megan realized its trajectory meant it would bump into her, and she took a careful step to her left. For a moment, she was afraid that even with her feet double layered in thick socks, she'd been too fast and made a noise. The Sightless hesitated for a second, its head tilted in her direction, and then continued towards the kitchen. Taj was sweating and shaking. He'd left the tin on the bench and held his hands at his sides in the pose they'd discovered worked best to stop shifting clothing noises. He stared straight ahead, his lips clenched shut as the Sightless circled towards him. He was holding his breath, and drops of sweat beaded over his face. He's frightened. They'll hear his heart. Megan squeezed her eyes closed, unwilling to watch as the Sightless honed in on her friend. Then shattering glass in a building across the street broke the silence. The Sightless froze for a fraction of a second, then both turned and shot through the room as grey blurs. They passed so near Megan, she felt the wind ruffle her hair. The creatures leapt through the window and crossed the street in 2 paces as they raced towards the unfortunate soul who'd been careless enough to make a noise. Megan finally inhaled, drawing breath into her starving lungs, and turned towards the kitchen. Taj had both hands pressed over his face and was shivering. As their unknown neighbour's screams rose into a terrified, agonized wail, Lisa picked up the half-open tin and offered it and a spoon to Megan. She tried to return the grim smile and scooped a spoonful of beans. She was practical enough to know there would be no safer time to eat than when any noises were masked by the screams